welcome to Berlinale Talents and to Worldbuilding Live, The Corner. It's good to have you all here, and we're very happy to have those wonderful experts and mentors and talents on stage for this event in cooperation with the Worldbuilding Institute. Thanks for that again. It is more like a workshop-ish atmosphere format, so we invite you to join in and share some ideas and thoughts. And yeah, without much more from my side, please welcome Juan, DiazB, the moderator of the session. Have fun.
Well, hello and thank you for coming. As Helena said, this is an initiative in collaboration with the Worldbuilding Institute. I'm Juan DiazB. I'm the European Director of the Worldbuilding Institute, and Alex McDowell is the Director of the Institute. And we have been working with the talents, opening a space for what we are developing, researching in new ways of approaching narrative. And this is what we call world building. Here we're going to see both examples on outcomes on world building. We're going to see reflections on how to disrupt narrative. And we're going to see what we are doing actually at the workshop. And this is why we have everyone sitting here, because it's a collaborative process. And this is what we want here. But also what we want from you is that you challenge what you're seeing, you question what is happening, and that we all engage into one single conversation. So the idea is that we are as active as possible into questioning, not necessarily with knowing what is happening, but actually what it's producing in you. And with that, it's like that's the essence of what we're doing today. So first, Alex is going to introduce some concepts on world building and some examples so that we can trigger this conversation.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. So yeah, let me take you through a little overview of world building. First, thank you to Berlinale and Talents. This is, I think, our 9th year here. It's always amazing. And we were talking in the workshop this morning is that I believe we kind of make radical discoveries every year that we come here, because the exchange of ideas is always really dynamic. And we're talking about a process that is really at its inception. You know, world building is known as a process perhaps that's associated with Tolkien or Lord of the Rings, you know, to those kind of epic writers, or with the game industry. But we're really talking about something fundamentally different. We're talking about a process that is designed to allow us to develop narratives for a really different world, for this world now, which is, first of all, very different technologically, that the tools available to us are fundamentally, radically different, and they change the way we should be thinking about storytelling. And then to sort of take on board a new responsibility as storytellers, and the diversity of media and outputs and outcomes and responsibilities to transmit new stories into the world requires that we start engaging with these stories in completely different ways. So we're going to talk about the idea of narrative as a kind of primary disruptor. And I'll start with this idea of the kind of evolution of storytelling, this very simple simplistic kind of overview that I will offer you, that storytelling started originally as a way for our original tribes to make sense of the world around us. And we developed, in the process of kind of working out what was in the shadows and describing that, or the silver disc going across the sky, translating it into a princess in a chariot, we developed the notion of metaphor, and the notion of these mythological stories, these grand evolutionary narratives, multiple storytellers transmitting stories across generations. Again, making sense of the world around us and imparting essential knowledge across generations. And then in 1440, the printing press slams down and everything changes. We go from this holistic understanding of the world to kind of a redirecting towards the single author. And so for the last 600 years, we've become habituated to the idea of the proscenium, of the author, the book, the photograph, the film, the theater proscenium, as I say, the composer, the music, the starchitect. And I think that we are now, and largely because of the new technologies and the capability they give us, we are able to actually rethink that relationship to narrative. So if we take the evolution of music, for example, from that highly composed sheet music following composer, conductor directed form into, say, jazz, where the form itself starts becoming completely different because the relationship between the musicians themselves and the components of the music evolve completely differently because they have this dynamic relation to one another, and each of those musicians is a collaborator in a dynamic process. So experiential theater develops like that way. The notion of live theater now, where you as an audience member stand on the stage, like in the play Sleep No More in New York, where you are actually engaging in a narrative that's existing in multiple different dimensions at the same time. You can't possibly see the linear narrative, and where you choose to place yourself in the world gives you a completely different relationship, a kind of spherical relationship to the narrative, and you become a participant in that storytelling process. And the linear, although there's nothing going away about cinema, the book, you know, the play, all of those are deeply important forms. We have to reconsider our relationship to the narrative space in a holistic, spherical way. And it's got everything to do with the complexity of the world that we're now again trying to make sense of. And so I would suggest that world building is this process which completely reimagines the way in which we engage with one another, what collaboration is, and the kind of stories that can evolve from that. That we can start to tell completely new stories because we base it in new practices and new kinds of collaboration. You know, the mixed reality space, virtual reality, augmented reality, are good provocations for the ways we have to think differently about storytelling. I don't believe deeply in the outcome of VR, the idea of putting a box on our heads and separating ourselves from our fellows. But I think that as an experience, as a provocation for the way we have to think about story differently, we are completely immersed in a kind of narrative space that we've never really experienced before. And we have to, again, we have to really think about how we narrate for that, how we tell these global narratives differently. So for me, this starts with a film called Minority Report. It's been a fair time now. We started this film in 1999. And when I was hired, there was no writer yet assigned. So the writer and myself were hired on the same day. And we had to rethink the idea of a scripted linear narrative because there really just wasn't a script. What we had was a few prompts from Steven Spielberg, the idea of a near-future world set in Washington, D.C. in 2050, with a sort of fundamental disruption at the core, the three precognitive beings that come out of the Philip K. Dick novel. And from that point on, we had to kind of extrapolate the world. That was sort of what we had. We knew that he wanted an apparently benign world, a world that appeared to be working well, that was green, that he could pull the rug out from under the audience when they realized that the loss of civil liberty was not worth the murder-free society that the precogs created. But to get there, we saw the influence of the precogs as a disruption on the way that a city would evolve, for example, that the population would pour into the city to come under the protective umbrella of the precogs in this murder-free society. A new city would spring up to accommodate the massive population. New kinds of technologies, transportations would evolve. And while we were evolving those narratives, we were also rethinking the core processes of the way we talked about and developed these stories. So at the time, there was no designer working in the industry, in the film industry, who was capable of creating architecture for the future. In terms of using the tools that architects were already using. So we actually hired artists working in Maya, working with architects into the art department, and we changed from a fully analog art department to a fully digital art department, and we really started re-examining the tools themselves as well as the content. And part of our process, because Steven Spielberg was asking for future reality, not science fiction, was to go out into the world and do deep research. And this is a fundamental part of world building, is that we went really deep into developing the world holistically and understanding it deeply in terms of the near future. So there's a lot of attention being paid to Minority Report as being predictive, very accurately predictive as a movie. It isn't that we were being so clever, it's just that we were listening carefully to the access we were being given because of Steven Spielberg's name, to research labs all over the country, to DARPA, to MIT Media Lab, to corporations like Apple or car companies who were working in research labs, working 15 years out, and they were showing us things like a little 2-inch square of ink that could be switched on and off on a flexible plastic sheet that became e-ink, that became the Kindle and the black and white electronic books that we know now. And then we just extrapolated forward with all of these ideas into the Internet of Things, into new kinds of architecture, into voice recognition, the gesture recognition of Minority Report, this system that was developed by a PhD student who was working for us, that eventually went into the world when he was asked if he could build it for real. And now he has a 150-person company in Los Angeles and just had a big injection of capital, and he has his methodology called mezzanine inside Fortune 500 companies all over the world. So that idea of design fiction actually changing the world in a specific and direct way was part of the process that we kind of discovered as we went along. And so this research process led to deep dives into things like fashion and architecture, into new kinds of technology, into advertising, into transportation systems, for example. And I'll just take you through the way that the evolution of, say, a dive into the interrogation around the future of transportation radically changed the way we thought about story. So in this case, we had already developed a city. We had the urban planning of this kind of wireframe city on the top left. And we asked the question, what would happen, or how would Tom Cruise get to work in the morning? So he lives at the top of the new city, and he goes to work in the old city. So we imagined a car that was actually a piece of furniture that would travel vertically on the outside of the building, like an elevator, and deliver him to the old city, a taxi cab. And in the process evolved actually the autonomous vehicle, even though there was no word for that at the time. So we had a new kind of narrative line that we were prototyping, like how would you actually develop in the design visualization system, how would you develop the capability of a car like that, what would it have to be capable of doing? And then how do you actually prototype it? So we were using 3D printing. We were spreading the data from the very inception into physical prototyping, into the illustrations, into full-scale models, to visual effects. So a single data stream, which was completely unfamiliar at that time in the film industry. And then finally, in the bottom left, the previs that developed out of this developed a narrative that I would suggest could not possibly have been discovered by a writer writing a script, that it came directly out of the world. So the world came first and the story evolved out of its capabilities. Which is actually what this is talking about. So, and you can see that the final film resembles the previs very exactly, because Steven Spielberg, in this case, for the first time using previs, was directing the digital space, and then the components of the film were put together from that. So that also starts flipping the model of the way we think about production, and the way we think about the production capability and the tools. We also realized that we could apply really radically different lenses to a world like this. So although there was a single linear narrative that evolved from Minority Report, We could have done an investigation into urban planning in time and space. We could have done an investigation into the future of advertising, the future of technology, as we've talked about, the future of mobility, as we've talked about. And we realized that as we had evolved this world, it had become this kind of coded system, this system of holistic, interlocking components, where the economic elements, the environmental, the political, the cultural, all have impact on the story as a whole. So if you start taking this out of film and start applying it across either a transmedia space, a lot of different media platforms, or indeed out into the real world, there's an opportunity here to go deeply into a set of ecologies. If you imagine that this is a sphere that we're looking down on, a slice-through sphere, so a huge range of possible story elements in any world, but being framed by a series of ecologies. On the outer ring, we have the where and the when, the context of the world, the resources, the environment, the economics, the terrain, the history. If this is a film or a story set on Mars, it's going to have very different sets of conditions than if it's in 16th century Paris. And then as we move in, we go from the world scale to the city scale. And at city scale, we're looking at these ecologies like energy and governance, infrastructure and culture, and then moving in through community, through family, and into the individual in the center, where the ecologies change from governance to mind, infrastructure to body, culture to self, energy to fuel. These are the kind of the areas that one has to inhabit for the space to really come to life and be able to support the stories. And then we ask these questions of the world, the what if, why not questions, around the verticals, which is the domains themselves. So if you want to know deeply about healthcare in the world, let's say, there's an opportunity to look at healthcare at the scale of the city, healthcare at the scale of a hospital and of the patient. And there's a direct connection between each of those. The patient pushes on the hospital pushes on healthcare, and vice versa. And there's a dynamic interchange in all of the component parts of this world space. So to go back to the kind of production methodology, this is still, I would say, unfortunately, a very familiar production process. This is actually taken from, I think, the 1940s. But, you know, a script is written, funding is raised around that script, a producer is attached to the funding process, a director is attached, the director fires the first writer, hires another writer, starts the process again. Eventually, the designer comes on, builds the set, the cinematographer comes in, changes the set because he wants to move all the lighting, the actors come in, they need a new door. In this linear process, this absolutely Victorian industrial process continues to evolve, one aspect meeting another aspect, meeting another aspect, to the extent that, for example, as production designer, I've never met the sound designer on 22 movies, even though you would think those two things were absolutely integral to one another. So after Minority Report, we sort of examined and rethought what that process might look like if it wasn't linear and industrial. And it started to look more like this, a kind of holistic space. This is very design-centric. This is also a model that was built in 2004, so it's evolved. But instead of starting with the script, we start with the actual story. And the inception of the idea evolves through design and through prototyping, through the integration. So all of those lines that are coming towards the center are different crafts and different skill sets in the process, starting to collaborate much earlier. And then we prototype through design visualization, through previs. And as we start doing this and the story starts resolving, so the resolution of the story matches the increase of resolution of the material itself, of the assets of the film. And then you go into capture, and then you go into finishing. So that was kind of the 2004 model. This is where we are, I think, more like 2019, maybe. this is taking, if you imagine that line from story going right through design visualization has actually now collapsed, and each of these lines is a quarter of those lines collapsed onto one another. I won't go into this in any great detail, but what's happening is that design, for example, if you look at the bottom two lines, as design starts, so visual effects starts really early on. And the reason for that is that we're all sharing the same assets. We're developing a core set of knowledge, which is rapidly turning into digital assets, which can just as easily be feeding a visual effects pipe stream as they can be feeding a design stream. And they're simultaneously going into design visualization. The director is stepping inside that world space. They can be inside VR. They can be location scouting within days of the earliest sets being designed. And storyboarding follows that blocking that's happened in digital world space. And then the virtual camera follows that. And then you start moving into production. But the script doesn't happen, potentially, until you're a third of the way into this process. And by the time you get to post-production, a lot of visual effects has already taken place. And so we're really collapsing the economics of production into this space. And this applies across all sorts of media. So we can look now at collapsing the game industry into the film industry, because the game engine is kind of a fundamental part of this process now. We're starting to share tools and starting to share processes. So moving into the sort of VR aspect of this, really starting to think about how spherical storytelling changes the way that we think about story and intersect it. This is a project we did at the school called Makoko at USC where I teach. So the provocation here, and worldbuilding often starts with the provocation, is what if in 2036 the economy of the world had collapsed through economic slump in 2019, and the economic back had become water, not gold or not oil, for example. And this village, Makoko, that was entirely impoverished, small village in Lagos, is now sitting on a new form of wealth. And so we imagined this relationship between character, environment, and the viewpoint turning into 6 narratives. We've got 6 characters here, all evolving simultaneously. A group of students building this world together with focus on a hacker, a gang leader, an educator, a cult leader, an Afrofuturist, a visionary. Each of those characters following a narrative thread from the time they get up to the end of the day. So all a single day in the life. We took these characters from this floating school that was actually built in 2014 and imagined that these young students, for the first time getting access to education in this school that was put into the center of the village, have now evolved into these characters. And they're responsible for changing the economic conditions of the village that they live in. So then really the next question is, how do you even start describing a story like this? You can see the kind of complexity of just these 6 characters in one day. You have these very complex story vectors and an exponentially complicated series of possible intersections of those narratives. So we built, in this case, and this is just as far as it went, our storyboarding process was built in VR, where you could follow each thread of the narrative, and then each thread was giving you illustrations, kind of keyframes from the storyboards, and giving us this opportunity to look at the intersection of flow, the motion of these people through space, the structure of the space itself, and the system that contains it. So I'd suggest that this is actually where we've come to in story. We've got this volatile, non-linear, holistic world space where there's a constant dynamic intersection between structure, flow, and system. This example is something we're in the middle of now. This is a project we're doing in my lab. It's about a year old now. The provocation here was that the School of Biology at USC, focusing on the pancreatic beta cell, no longer have the language, the semantics to be able to talk to other scientists, even other biologists, because they are existing in such an esoteric space at the scale of this single, molecule. And they are losing knowledge because they're not able to interchange with other biologists, chemists, physicists, or mathematicians, any other of the sciences, and indeed be able to gather artists into this space. So what we proposed was that we would imagine the single cell as a city, and try and map the systems of a city and a single cell together. They're similar in terms of complexity, but we had to find kind of a common language which would allow people to understand certain elements of the cells and proteins as structure, certain elements as characters, as it were, and the infrastructure that they're flowing between, and the cause and effect and the tasks that they're executing. So we came up with the metaphor of origami, and origami combined with the city in a gravity-free relationship between a very abstract city, a city that really was architecture, occupants, and infrastructure. The simplicity of origami with all of the complexity that it's capable of, so a single sheet of paper capable of sort of infinitely complex folds, was really immediately a metaphor that both the scientists and the artists could understand. And having evolved that, then we could really look at sort of the massive range of scale in this world. It's a range within this single world of a mountain and a mouse. So there's all sorts of navigational issues to be solved. You have to be able to travel great distances and very small distances simultaneously with the navigation. And so finally, this is where we are right now. So this is a VR experience which is going to be matched to a website. So you move into this world, you start becoming empathetic with certain characters in the world, you go back into the website, you discover more about them, you go back into the VR world, and this becomes a dynamic space for scientists to use practically to start moving towards new discoveries inside the pancreatic beta cell. I'll just play a little piece of it. So this is a super early model, very low resolution, but the idea is that you can start forming these kind of emotional bonds with these very abstracted characters and really get to know them deeply. And they're already recognizable to the scientists. They're already scientifically accurate. So this kind of art-science relationship where we're beginning to realize that there's far more areas of overlap and confluence than we thought. It took, 6 to 8 months just to find that common language, but now we're there. It's actually a really fantastic, exciting, dynamic relationship that's developing in the lab, and really beginning to understand that we can transcend these form of kind of barriers between art and science. All of this ultimately comes down to storytelling, and an example I use a lot is the notion of the ocean. So we globally have really no understanding of what's happening underneath the ocean. Sylvia Earle, who's the amazing marine biologist, says no blue, no green. that if the ocean fails, we stop breathing. It's a fundamental piece of knowledge that we should be all in possession of. And yet, if the kind of collapse of the coral reefs in the ocean was known, was translated into the trees in Central Park, there would be panic in the streets. You know, there is massive disruptive destruction, sort of death occurring in the ocean. And the fact that we don't know that is, I would suggest, is a failure of storytelling. It's absolutely the responsibility of the storytellers, of all of us in this room, to start engaging with these kind of narratives. So not just in the kind of entertainment media space, but to start applying the story capabilities we have, the tools we have, to really creating change in the real world in the same way as we've seen, you know, even back to Minority Report, seeing these actual changes happen through fiction into reality. So in the case of the ocean now, this is a project that is in full sway. It comes out in 2019. There's a game. The BBC is doing an IMAX film. There's a TV series, interactive media through the game, as I say. A sort of massive platform for education, new opportunities and assets for museums. And so you have this process that is really going through the same kind of world-building, holistic and scale-based investigation, being pushed out into story outcome and then distributed across multiple media to create, hopefully, real change. Now, what we've been doing in the workshop, and we continue on Wednesday, a lot of you have already been there. I think we would welcome, are we allowed to say that? Juan? If anybody else wants to join us on Wednesday. But the issue we've always had is that even with Makoko, which was a small village, it's almost too large to get a group around to actually investigate. So we're really looking now at what's the kind of smallest system that we can investigate that can represent a larger system in the space. So this year we're focusing on the idea of a street corner as a narrative container. And if we can start looking at a single street corner as a systemic space for multiple narratives, where we can start really learning deeply about the dynamic interactions between people, large disruptions like massive migration coming into cities, like climate change, like crime, or the future of work, the sort of ideas that are imminently going to affect our near future. But think about it as story space that's capable of creating evolutionary narratives that can actually change the way people think about the world. We have this opportunity to look at displacement, at these complex systems that contain it, and create a new revolution around the future of cities. So this is what we're doing this morning. We're using a game called The Thing from the Future, which is a future-facing set of provocative cards, provocations that trigger narratives. So the whole group was looking at that idea that each table was working on one street corner of 3 in a single city. The city, I think, is Berlin, we're deciding. And we're looking 20 years out. And the disruption is massive migration, a big population coming into the city. So we have the 3 groups, ABC. We're looking at the core story space, the influence of that space on its neighborhood, and the connections between the different spaces, looking through the lenses of the systems, the structures themselves, residential, recreational, service, and commerce. So you start building out the architecture of the story space itself, and then populate it with the human lens, multiple human lenses in this space, and start investigating it where the flow through that structure is being overviewed by the system that controls it. So one of the things we did at the beginning of the day, which has been really interesting in these classes and workshops, is that we asked everybody to imagine a street corner that they knew well. And I could ask you the same thing now, is just imagine and remember either something from your memory or from your present, a single street corner, and think about it as a way in which to investigate or to trigger a new narrative space. So kind of the same position we were put in with Minority Report, start from scratch with no script, with just the components of the world, and start imagining how you might create characters and narratives within that. Think about that as the script container, the narrative container. On the top right there, that was the first hour of investigating this with our class, where we were looking at post-industrial cities, we were looking at medieval cities, we were looking at a future city like Shanghai, and looking at suburbia and all of the conditions that would drive that. But if you want to just investigate a street corner of your own, note down this, this web link. It'll take you to a survey. And the survey gives you an opportunity to input all of the data that you know about that city, about your street corner in the city or the town or even the village that you know. And all of that data will start adding to a database that we're building, which is to create a systemic lens that really allows us to interrogate city after city after city and to get to know this better, to be able to develop a system for storytelling. Thank you very much. So, I think, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, because it has come always when we have done this particular conversation with the audience, is to understand what is world building. And in the sense that, obviously, when we see these projects, we may think or may tend to think that it's about the technology that is there, but actually the true technology is what we have been developing for these years of understanding what are the concepts that can shift and hack the way we think and the way we approach. And this is why we have among our guests people that are working in many different areas of narrative and trying to understand how that narrative can affect the world, both from the point of view of technology, but also from the point of view of real impact in the world, so that we don't keep only what we saw in terms of visualization, but we keep the process, mostly, that we can apply both in paper or further on into this prototyping process to a high level of detail and resolution. And that's a key also, because we're going to see that among our guests, we have people that are trying to apply new ways of narrative to change the world. And if we think that right now we live in the age of connectivity, in which the Internet of Things is going to connect everything, we can think of narratives that are not based on a platform like this, but the world itself, it's a programmable place for narratives. So this is something that we have to think as narrators, as filmmakers, that we are going to tap into a place where narrative is going to be the way in which we construct and deconstruct the world. So I think...
Is narrative the right word? Excuse me, I'm really frustrated. Are you sure that narrative is the right word?
What word would you use? No, that's great to hear. What word would you use? Or what's your...
You should ask people here what they would say.
Sure.
That word is limiting, because the things you're talking about growing, the diversification.
Yeah.
Maybe narrative is not the right word. Films now, I guess, we might call them abstract.
Mm-hmm.
People have been talking about abstract hip-hop, for instance.
Sure.
You know, people run up to me in the middle of the dance show in the street, on the corner, and they ask me what it is. I'd rather not define my dance. It's something that happens between you and me, and you decide what it is. So I'd be grateful if you'd ask the people, maybe you need to finish your presentation, please, if you'd ask people what they think's happening in film and generally in what you call storytelling, because I think maybe we need to look at it in a more similar way to painting and how that works, please.
I think that's a great point, and I totally appreciate it. I think we've spent a lot of time trying to find those words, and in many ways, I think perhaps we're trying to give a larger context to that word, just to say narrative is not linear necessarily, very specifically. Sorry?
We invent new words to
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure you're right. I think ultimately those words will evolve. But
They're going to be late though.
huh?
See, if the word isn't out there, that limits the way people work on this a lot. The words that we choose and the suggestions we choose, and some I just don't say. I don't say should. I don't say normal. That's my choice.
Yeah.
Mainly.
Yeah, thank you.
This is a hat. What? Hi.
That's a non...
Is this a virtual extrapolation of a potential incandescence? Yeah. So, oh, right.
That is your microphone.
Wow. Yeah, it could be my whole home, just one little couch for my body. Yeah, so I think that what happens is that the lag wouldn't help, because we'd like to reach everyone, surely, you know? We'd like to include everyone and reach everyone. And if the word is behind what's happening in the world, like sometimes I think the systems are behind the people, the way the people are needing to adapt today. And the people are really adapting very well, just like any other animal. I like to see it that way. And I think we need to try and pay attention to the language and how that influences people's thinking. Yeah. So I think we need actually maybe really to spend more time concentrating on choosing the right words and introducing ones.
I think it's a great point. And I would like to ask our guests actually that question. Could you introduce yourselves, and then maybe that's where we start? Yeah, just say... Sorry? Yeah, but I think talk about your work. No, I mean, we're going to do like proper introduction, yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Grace Lee. I'm a filmmaker from Los Angeles. I work in fiction and nonfiction, and somewhere in between fiction and nonfiction primarily. I actually was a talent in the very first talent campus, so I've been in your shoes. And I think I'm here because I am a recent world builder. I was in a world build with the Worldbuilding Institute in Los Angeles last summer around the theme of the future of work in Los Angeles in 20 years. And this was an artist residency through the Sundance Institute New Frontiers program, which is sort of their experimental side. And I come from sort of traditional long-form filmmaking, like I think many of you do, really just, you know, feature-length documentaries and narrative, or not narrative, but fiction films. And, you know, I was really interested...
Give up on narrative just because he
not,
says so.
Yeah. I was really interested in this interactive world and different ways of storytelling. And my introduction to this world came last year when I made a sort of interactive web documentary about the 1992 Los Angeles riots. There were all these projects being made from studios and television broadcasters about that event, which took place, which is a very volatile event, if people aren't aware, in 1992 after the brutal beating of a black man by LAPD. And it sort of unleashed this kind of fury in Los Angeles. And I wanted to tell a different story based on narratives that I was aware of and also stories that I had heard over many years. And so I decided to create something on the internet, which basically questioned who gets to tell the story of Los Angeles in 1992. So I was already interested in deconstructing what kind of story is told about this event. And that sort of led me to, from there I entered the world build about the future of work, and I was very invested in a specific neighborhood, Koreatown in Los Angeles, which is where I live. And anyway, that's a little bit of a segue, but in the world build, we were thinking about what kind of future of work, what is the future of Los Angeles that we want to see? And as someone who's lived there for the previous 20 years, we were thinking about 20 years from now, what's that going to look like? And we had a similar type of thing that we're doing here at the Talents, where artists and scientists and archivists and experts would come in and we would talk about various issues related to different systems, whether it's transportation or government or green spaces or a lot of the things that were outlined here. And some ideas came out that sort of looking at ancestral, looking at artificial intelligence, and an idea came out that I was very inspired by called ancestral AI. And this was really this sort of got my wheels spinning, because for the first few weeks of the world build, I was very confused. I don't know if there are any confused people in this room right now, but I was looking at the board and thinking, what's going on? I don't understand any of this. But when this ancestral AI idea came out, I realized that I had a kind of connection to it through documentary filmmaking, because I was interested in looking at a way to, figuring out a way to connect to the past, learn from the past in a different way, in a different storytelling manner. Should I keep going? Yeah, okay. And so there's two things that happen. Sorry, I'm a little bit all over the place, but this is what happens in world builds, I think. Two things that happen to me often when I'm making documentaries. One is, there's all this footage that you shoot, and only a fraction of it ends up in your film. So you have hours and hours of footage that never see the light of day, but it's all this incredible material that you may have collected and just sits on your hard drive. The other thing that is very personal to me, and this is how I began to really understand what world building was by looking at it through a personal lens, was the idea that I spend all this time interviewing people who are complete strangers, extrapolating meaning from their stories, yet I haven't really done that for my own family, which would help me understand something about my own history and things like that. So with aging parents in my vicinity, I've always regretted that I haven't done that yet. So when the opportunity to think about ancestral AI came up, I started thinking about documentary as a form of ancestral AI. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to turn my parents into ancestral AIs. But as I did that, I realized there's a person who I made a film about several years ago, incredible writer, philosopher, and activist named Grace Lee Boggs. She was a Chinese-American living in Detroit and very active in the civil rights and Black Power movement. And I spent about 10 years making this documentary. I realized that I had incredible amount of archival material with her, interviews, recordings, verite footage following her around the city of Detroit. Not only that, documentation of meetings and conversations that she had with all kinds of people, famous and not famous. The fact that she exists, and she had written many books, many pamphlets, many articles about a wide variety of ideas, including, I think, the future of work, complex systems, things like that. I decided, well, maybe I could turn this person, who I already have like a great amount of material on, into a prototype for an ancestral AI, and that's the outcome that came out of this future of work world build. And so that's the idea that I'm starting to develop, and I don't know if I should add anything else.
Well, I think just maybe where you think it's going to go.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So I think for me, what was interesting to me about this process was, I had already made a documentary about this person that had, shown widely in festivals and broadcast and everything. But I realized I wasn't done with this story, and there was a new way to interact or to sort of engage with this person's story. She was somebody who, as she died in 2015 at the age of 100, and since then, as many of you know, we've had many tumultuous events happen in the United States. A lot of times, I wondered, what would Grace Lee Boggs have to say about, Trump being elected, or, all of these people, all these mass shootings that are happening. She was somebody who is very involved in thinking about these big issues. And so the idea is to, use all of the data and information that exists and somehow find a container for it to come out in a different way. One of the other things that exists from Grace, aside from her vast body of work and recordings that I've collected, is her house in Detroit is still standing, and has been left untouched. And I was talking to the trustees of the estate about what's going to happen to this house, because she was very interested in, maintaining the space so that people could come by. It's a house that's full of all kinds of stories. You know, she lived there from the 1950s up until 2015. It's a community space for, you know, on the east side of Detroit, which has experienced a lot of different kinds of events that have gone on there. And, you know, the idea is that we create this Boggs House is an opportunity to have a site-specific documentary experience by entering this house and interacting with some of the objects and stories that this house holds. So in a way, it's relating to the story, you know, the world in a street corner, because this house carries so many stories, so many ideas, so many untapped narratives. And this is the idea that is still in sort of research and development stages. So.
I think this is great, and actually coming from that challenge to the world, I think what we have to challenge is what is our position as storytellers. Because the problem that I find there is that usually we think of ourselves as linear storytellers, of creating narratives that are in the structure that we are used to, and what we think is the outcome. But actually, narration, it's our way of making sense of the world, and science is already tackling to that. The way our brain is trying to make sense of the world is actually through creating stories that connect, because it's this elemental connection and this flow of these elements that actually brings sense to everything. And actually, maybe each of our other guests talk on how their own approach to narrative is actually tackling something else in the world, is redefining the place of narration and storytelling for the application. Do you want to start, maybe Megan? Do you want to start on your take on the position of the narrator and narrative in our times?
Okay, hi, my name is Megan Elliott. I'm the founding director of the Johnny Carson Centre for Emerging Media Arts. Prior to that, I had a company that's still going that I built with my husband starting in 2003 at the Sydney Opera House, which was all about digital media. And we took that to 14 countries and 22 cities around the world. And prior to that, I was actually the executive director of the Australian Writers Guild. So I used to look after all the writers in Australia from film and television and theatre. And to that guild, I introduced the notion of writing for games and starting to train people around that. So back in the early 2000s, I had my epiphany that it was actually interactive and that the audience should be at the centre of the story, not at the end, as you showed us in the Victorian production processes. So when it comes to narrative, at the moment, there's one narrative or one world that I'm building, and that's called the Johnny Carson Centre for Emerging Media Arts. So I'm world building a brand new educational facility and a brand new program. So I'd like to know who you are. I'd like to know, has anybody here played with AR or VR? Great. What about games? Are people working with Unity? Brilliant. So I'm with my people. I guess I'm not a maker, so I'm not really qualified to speak about narrative, but I'd just like to sort of respond to Alex a bit. I guess if what we're talking about the future of work or the future of our industry, or we're talking about finally having 21st century production processes almost 20% of the way through the 21st century, to that end, our educational processes are also Victorian and also need to change. And I don't think we can talk about the future of our industries or the future of our work without talking about the future of education. And I'd also be really keen to hear from you what you missed out of your education or what you wish you could learn right now, because those are the kinds of things that our students have got to be learning. In terms of our world build of the Johnny Carson Centre, we've been speaking and co-designing with industry. I guess it's one of the reasons I'm here, to make sure that we're doing world building within our course. And just one of the things that in our world, which is a world of machine intelligence, knowing something doesn't matter anymore. Content is not king, because you can Google that. So it's learning above knowing. And so what I'm really interested in is developing new literacies. And I think that all of us need to have these new literacies, regardless of whether or not we want to stay with conventional cinema or not. And that's the literacy of data, understanding it, knowing how to use it, knowing how to collect it. The literacy of technology, knowing what's under the hood and how to make it work. And human literacy, how we communicate with each other, or storytelling. And that leads us all to have 4 new cognitive capacities. And those cognitive capacities we all need as storytellers to survive in the age of machine intelligence is systems thinking, critical thinking, entrepreneurship, and human agility. So again, it's technology and the ability to tell stories. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
That's fantastic.
Sorry? The 4th thing, systems thinking, critical thinking, entrepreneurship, and cultural agility. Now, I have to do a disclaimer here. I was very, very influenced by a book called Higher Education in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, and I might have taken those ideas from there.
Thank you, Megan. We are going to now pass to Luis so that he introduces himself and he tells us how world building and his work on sustainability can merge.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Luis Akenji. I work in Tokyo with a think tank called Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. And as you can guess from the name, I'm not a filmmaker or I don't come from a very creative background. I come from one of those more boring aspects of science and policy. But I can promise you it's not as boring as you think, because here's one of the reasons, and here's one of the reasons why you ought to slap people like me in the face. When we think of the future, when we think of a society where you should be in the future, the first things that come to our minds as researchers and as scientists is, what are the resource constraints, for example, that people are going to face when they go about their daily lives? What is climate change going to do to us and to our different communities? And what about the biodiversity loss that is happening all across the globe? And what about human adaptability? And I'm sure if I go on and on, some of you would begin to recognize some of the debates that are going on in your societies. For example, about climate change in the US, about migration in Europe, and so on. All of these are heavily interlinked to what I usually call sustainability. And part of what we try to do is to help governments and businesses make sense of this and then design interventions that can lead to solving these problems. If that sounds boring, that's because it is. It's essentially because we don't have storytellers that can give us perspectives that are different from what historical trends have shown us. It's essentially because we don't have models or frameworks that can guide us produce more sort of collaborative narratives towards where we want to go as a future of society. And so we find ourselves really stuck in a situation where we're being shaped by the guy who is on TV, who can argue more loudly about whether climate change is happening or not. And not necessarily, I was going to ask if there's water here. The guy shaping the narrative here is the guy who is on TV and who can shout louder. Or if you look at it from another perspective, we gave an example today where I was sort of saying, most of what we know as society are heroes, the people we find on public squares, the people that we worship, we read about in textbooks, are people that sat on horses and went around killing each other and all this bloodbath in society. This is the narrative that has designed the society that we inherited. And we've taken this along, and what we show is a picture of the more negative aspects. The question becomes, instead of this singularity, heroes and warfare, this singularity is resource constraints, this singularity is people going out of economic actors trying to optimize profits. Can we create settings where there are multiple voices, multiple perspectives, and that are not only looking at the past, or at least they're considering the past, but jointly creating a future that can then help policymakers find pathways towards that? And I think this is where in my work, for example, we've come against challenges just because we've not been able to get this kind of methodologies and frameworks. And so I've been telling Alex that a part of my discovery about world building is exactly that perhaps scientists and researchers don't have the full suite of tools that can then help us find a pathway to the future. The question becomes then, what is the role of storytellers that can help us towards this? How do you bear upon this in a way that helps society see where it should go, in a way that helps us interpret facts or data in a way that is more realistic and that is more positive? And in a sense, in a deliberative process where we're co-creating something that we all share rather than something that is dictated by experts or dictated by policymakers that are backed by very narrow platforms and all of this. So to me, this is engaging with this process and with a group like this is really something that I think I'd like to take away from here.
Thank you. As you see, and actually that's part of the challenge that we are making and we are making every year, is the fact that, and I actually was a talent myself, and I started as director and as a designer in different editions of the talents. But then diving into the idea of storyteller in different, and the possibilities of different platforms, but also the possibility of having some impact in the world by understanding the position of the storyteller in a different way. It's something that we will have to face, because at the end, that construction that we are making, those ideals that we are making, are the way that we are projecting the future. The way that we create the future is the way that we construct through the ideals of what we want to achieve. So if we are able to create new ideals and new constructions for the people, we are also able to hack the future through those constructions that we are dealing. And those constructions are actually stories. And those stories can come in very different forms, as you can see from the point of view of education or the environment, but it's us who are trying to understand how to tell those stories, plus the idea of a new method that allows us to really expand that concept that might help us to connect both other disciplines and our own discipline into something more powerful than what we are actually doing right now, both in how we tell those films, but also other stories that we tell in other platforms. So far, because the idea is that we have a conversation, do we have any questions so far so that we can engage into this, both about world building or what we have been talking about? Yeah? Troy.
Yeah, so I would like to know what is your take on blockchain, and maybe you have different areas, and it would be interesting to know your take on blockchain and narration and content, and
Who wants to take that? Luis, you seem eager to that.
I was just wondering, do you have to ask a difficult question? Couldn't you have looked for something simpler? I wasn't going to provide an answer to that, but I think that we've had a discussion within our institute and with our partners who are working with development agencies. And I can tell you the headline news here is, we don't understand what it is. And we're still fumbling to understand what it is. This is quite important and it's quite instructive. This is why your question is very incisive. If we don't even understand what it is, it means we are advising policymakers without even having the tools that are coming from tomorrow. So your question exactly exemplifies why there's a need for a narrative that already starts bringing in these voices, so that there's an ability for policymakers, for researchers, for scientists to start seeing options or opportunities which they did not see before that can help them interpret the messages that they want to put across. Maybe it's a little bit of an exaggeration that we don't understand at all, but to a certain extent, there are lots of discussions now about how to use blockchain technology and development aid, how to use blockchain technology and distribution, blockchain technology and logistics. But the clarity, the granularity that is needed in that is not yet available, at least not within the sustainability community. And from our understanding, it's one of the principal tools that could be extremely useful.
Maurice, maybe you can have a take on that?
So I'm Maurice Conti. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at a little company called Alpha. We're Europe's first moonshot factory, so we try and do projects that are going to affect hundreds of millions of people, eventually grow into multi-billion-dollar companies, and are net force for good. Those are sort of our three founding principles as we go about these projects. Excuse me, blockchain does get talked about a lot at the office. We have scientists working on artificial intelligence and we have a lot of smart people there. And blockchain is both a passionate subject and a bit of a joke, depending on what day of the week it is. And I think Lewis brings up an excellent point. Most people don't understand what it is. Blockchain in and of itself is actually quite simple and not that big of a deal. It's what it could potentially be applied to that's super interesting. So, understanding the technology is not that hard. It's a few lines of code. But really using imagination and maybe narrative to explore what one could do with blockchain, eliminating state-backed currencies, tracking, all kinds of commodity trading, including things that affect climate change. What else could you do with it? Shoot, I had a really good one that I just forgot.
Smart contracts.
Smart contracts, corruption is maybe something that we could really make a dent with this family of technologies. I think that's where the interesting conversation is, not in the technology itself. I would say most people that talk about it, journalists and stuff, they have really no idea what it is. It's kind of like AI, like whenever you hear somebody say AI and machine learning, you already know they don't know what they're talking about. It's like saying cars and steering wheels. One is a subset of the other. I think you hit the nail on the head.
I'm actually very interested in blockchain and research about what it can do for the creative industries. I'm interested in it in the perspective of smart contracts, so being able to track ownership. I'm interested in the fact that it's a distributed ledger and that micropayments may mean frictionless payments, because someday we've got to work out new business models to pay for what it is you love to do, right? So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in destroying. No, now I sound flippant. I'm not supposed to sound flippant. I'm interested in removing collecting societies because they take money from artists. And if you can distribute automatic payments because you've got a smart contract to people by using a cryptocurrency, and the musician Imogen Heap has been experimenting with this, I'm all for it. I think that we should really investigate, because there's some really smart ways that I'm sure could benefit creators much more so than the current models we have today.
I think to take that and to take blockchain and connect it to our corner. Because the thing is that right now what we're doing at the workshop is precisely taking a street corner, right, and creating the frame of that street corner in 20 years. So if we think about blockchain, which we are not understanding right now, but we know that has a lot of potential to create great things, but also to disrupt things in not such a positive way, then how that we can extrapolate into the future. How if we disrupt the way that economy is happening, the way that contracts are being made, the ways that people are paying for the content that, for example, you are creating, that already is changing your entire industry. But how do we think about that? How do we clarify the parameters? And this is the process that we are doing, trying to understand these ecologies, trying to understand how they connect, and how one thing that changes the whole. Because that's the whole thing, that when we create stories, we need to understand that connectivity between the elements. Yeah, over there.
Hello? Okay. My name is Mark Tschechner. I'm a behavioral neuroscientist and a science fiction poet. And I've got a question for you, since we're talking about world building in the future. I like to think about artificial intelligence, and I wonder, since we are talking about the future, artificial intelligence is probably going to play a role in it. You just said whoever says artificial intelligence doesn't know what he's talking about. Alex, you said you had a quote by William Gibson earlier, who has, I think, an interesting take, saying that basically artificial intelligence is the combination of man and machine. I'm trying to figure out what it is. What is it? What is your opinion?
Maurice, do you want to?
What I said is when you hear people say artificial intelligence and machine learning concatenated, then maybe they don't have the full picture. What is artificial intelligence? Maybe we can talk about where in the relevant future things are going to go. There's a lot of talk about general artificial intelligence. So these are AIs that can operate at a human level. Some people say above, some people say slightly below, but these are AIs that can have sort of general problem solving. They can behave like a human or maybe a child. I think that's quite a ways off, probably not in my lifetime. Some of you are much younger than me. Maybe in your lifetimes, maybe not. What I think is interesting, and kind of to Alex's point about AI being computational system plus human intelligence combined, is narrow AIs. So narrow AIs are the AIs that we have today, self-driving cars, a handful of AIs, 4 or 5 different computational systems, but narrow ones. They're like really good at one thing. Computer vision is a class of artificial intelligence. It does one thing, like see, oh, there's a box right there, I get that. Data processing is another narrow one. Siri is a narrow AI. What I think is interesting is think of these narrow AIs as a toolbox, and you have access to these tools to augment your own human capabilities. And where I think the most interesting discourse is to think about what could we achieve that neither artificial or human intelligence could achieve on its own. And by combining the two, I think we start to be able to do things that we've never been able to do before, like hopefully solve some of the increasingly large problems that we face. So I think that's kind of the warm spot in the discourse. Trying to build general AIs, especially general AIs based on human intelligence. There's like all this excitement about building AIs that work like our own brains do, and I don't get that at all. So first of all, who says human intelligence is the best intelligence, right? This sort of anthropocentric thing that like we're the best, and so we have to, in our own image, like gods, create these intelligences. I don't get that. Again, it's going to take a while, and yeah, I just don't see that as the best model. They're all different kinds of intelligences. I mean, you're a science fiction poet. Use that poetry to imagine these different kinds of intelligences that we could model artificial or synthetic intelligences against. I think that's maybe the more interesting discourse.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that what's really interesting about the discussion is it makes us start to think about what is essential about being human, good or bad. Why reproduce the thing that we already do implicitly well? And that notion of poetry, I mean, we use this increasingly now, especially when we're talking with the scientists, for example, in the Cell Project, is to just start to distinguish what it is that engages the empathetic, engages the things that we do intuitively well, the way that we can engage with one another. And then I think it becomes really interesting if you, exactly as Maurice is saying, is if you start thinking about AI as a kind of enhancement or an augmentation of our capabilities. To go back to what Grace was saying about the Grace Lee Boggs home, I'm fascinated by the idea that it is the house that is the soul of Grace Lee Boggs, or the objects that she has touched, and that the cumulative environment, which has a historical reach back 50 years and has a spatial reach through three floors and through all of these personal objects that she's touched, are a fascinating way of extending the narrative. And at that point, those kind of artificial intelligences become incredibly valuable because you can tap into, rapid search, extremely rich and deep access to archiving, to start delivering narratives that literally start to become a kind of offset to Grace Lee Boggs, not copying and not making a hologram of Grace Lee Boggs, but actually thinking about this notion of us augmented into our environment. And it actually taps back into some things like soul, like a kind of historical, mythological connection into culture, which is much more interesting, I think, than whether we focus necessarily on whether robots are going to replace us as car drivers.
By the way, just real quick on the robots replacing us, if you guys need to have something to be fearful of throughout your day, I really wouldn't worry about the killer AI for a whole bunch of reasons we can talk after. I think the imminent threat is much more ourselves. I think we're much more likely to annihilate ourselves than some super powerful AI doing it for us. And exactly, and if the AI does do it, we created the AI, so the AI can only instantiate our own morals and ethics by definition, because it's our creation. And so if the AI kills us, it was us doing it in the first place, if you really want to extrapolate way out. But
I think one of the keys there, that I want to tap, is precisely in terms of the tools, because I think the tools are also limiting the way that we create stories and the expansion of what that concept is. Because so far we have been very textual and we have been very linear in the way that we create that. And our language and our way of communicating and creating, it's set in a very specific way, but we usually based it in text and speech. But it's very linear the way that we are thinking. And actually these kind of tools allow us to use our body and to really tap into something that goes beyond the voice and the text, that actually allow us to have a communication that way goes into a different place, like sculpting really thoughts on sculpting visuals and audio in a completely intuitive way. And I think this is where we are, you know, and trying to understand how to create the concepts that allow us to connect new tools with a new way of thinking that makes that leap between what we are used to think that we are, what the limit of the stories that we are set that we had, and what we are actually capable of in collaboration through the right ways of thinking and the possible ways of interconnecting within each other, and those tools that might come out of technology. But before that, we have to change the way we approach, and this is what we have been developing, a new technology to think, to approach, to do, and a new way of interacting with those ideas.
I appreciate what Alex said about the historical reach of this house. And one of the things I just wanted to mention is, you know, when I was interviewing Grace for so many years, you know, talking to her is like talking to history, like history embodied. And so if I wanted to think about a story as a conversation, I think that there's many ways to converse with a space, many ways to converse with objects. You know, it's a different kind of relationship, and that's one of the ways I think world building helps shift how I think about story. So,
yeah, that's great.
Just with the AI thing again, what it means, I believe, is that we have to become more human, and we have to become better humans. So we have to be more creative, and we have to be more empathetic, which is what Alex alluded to. And in terms of changing the narrative, and the other thing about AI is it is going to automate jobs, right? We know that. It has, and it's automated some really dull, boring parts of editing and whatever else already, which is great. But I think one of the narratives we have to change is when we talk to each other and when we talk to young people and we think about this in terms of speculative futures. The thing, what does your uncle always ask your little sister? What do you want to be when you grow up? Well, I think that's the wrong question, and I'm actually getting this from Heather McGowan. We need to change that narrative to be how do you want to be when you grow up? Because when you ask someone what, you're limiting their identity to a job that may not be there in the future. So I think that's kind of a narrative we want to change. And everybody's touched on ethics, but I think because we're at these very nascent stages of starting these new industries of VR and AR and MR, we really need to put a stake in the ground around ethics and inclusivity and get that right now.
Yes?
Thank you. I'm Konrad Ritter. The reason why I'm here is I scanned through the Berlinale program and looked for something which is forward-looking and not just documenting or backward-looking, and so I'm glad to be here. I happen to be involved in a group which is mostly younger than me and is creating a pan-European political movement because they're very concerned with what has happened there, and so they want to become proactive. So I'm interested in your approach actually on two sides. One of the concerns here in Europe is there's no connection of citizens, and even more so young citizens, to what is this European idea. And so the question is, how would what you are developing as a methodology help to engage and to bring out a story and meaning to something? And in that context, I guess I'm wondering whether what you observed when you do your corner work, etc., is it stories about the future which are extrapolations of the past, or are these stories of an imaginative future, narrative, or whatever word, and those driven by fear? There is a negative story which will be extrapolating, or is it about possibilities? And I'm asking that because I was working on a piece, Future of Work, in that new sort of political movement, how to position itself. And I worked with an Italian colleague, and we both said we want to work about future of work. And after quite a while, we realized we used the same topic, but came from very different angles. When he speaks in the street of Italy about future of work, there is fear about employment disappearing, new forms of work, putting more people out of work. I was coming from a place of opportunity. Wow, what new time sovereignty will there be there for the next generation to come? So that's why I would be very curious in your experience. And then, and there I finish, how does the stories, the narratives, the images which emerge translate into political shaping? And there I'm following up on your point. I have a big doubt in my mind, and I hope you can work and clarify that yes, we create images there, but there is a difficult bridge into the actual decision making, because we know decision making is not driven primarily by imagination, by the future, but by a lot of very vested interests, which I don't see yet how the narrative will change. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question, or a series of questions. I think you're diving deep into a lot of the things that are fundamental to what we're exploring in world building. One of the first, to answer one of your points, in which no particular order, we look to the future very specifically and deliberately. So depending on who we're working with, we put a lot of attention into how far forward we look. And the reason for that is to do with the scale of fiction, actually, or the fundamental power of fiction, not to just draw a thread from the past into the future as a simulation, if you like, or as a trend, following a trend, but to see whether we can't actually take control over the period between this moment just past and this moment just ahead of us, and forward from here. Where fiction starts, anything could happen, the roof could fall in, things would start changing dramatically in our near future, potentially. We think about, and with the Street Corner now, we're looking at a 20-year arc of time ahead, because it really allows us to engage fiction. And fiction is, I think, this kind of secret sauce of world building, in that it does allow you to say, I am looking to push the narrative in a specific direction and to take control over the entire sort of evolution of the threads that we're following. I think the other part of it, and you raise it with the two sides of the coin of you and your friend coming to two different points of view around the same subject, is that this notion of collaboration is not insignificant, that the more people you bring to the table, the more there is this kind of collective wisdom that assembles. And so I think that there is an opportunity when you combine deep knowledge, like a lot of research, a lot of expertise, and a lot of the people that we gather to the projects we do are specifically expert in multiple fields. Each one of them brings a new sort of stimulation to the story space. But the next person that comes in may contradict that, and you have to find common ground. So we've found, for example, that almost always there is neither a utopian nor a dystopian outcome for the world build, because a balance actually it finds itself. And to some extent, I think that equates to a truth. With as much information and knowledge as we have, I think we find a truth the more people we gather around these issues and the deeper we go. So a lot of the idea of, let's see, just going back to this for a second. A lot of what happens as this world builds out, the more questions you ask, which are all of those little words, if you like, all scattered all over the map there, the more robust the world becomes. And you start defining rules and rule sets that come from the provocations you ask. So you ask sort of like, what will the future of work become? And then you start examining what that means. Well, in what aspect of work, with who, which age group, how does the economy change to accommodate it, et cetera, et cetera. And those questions, that interrogation of the world space, makes that world more and more robust. Now, I believe that you can engage non-storytellers as part of that group all the time. And that means that you can engage policymakers as participants and partners in the way that the narrative develops, because they have core information. They are the experts of their own space. But it's the partnership. It's not like you get given a brief by a client and then you write the script. It's developing a new form of what collaboration means, and that notion of we are all partners in this together. We're all diving deep into knowledge. So going back to the art science project, the cell, me and my team knew nothing about molecular biology when we started, and the molecular biologists knew nothing about the possibilities of narrative. But you evolve into common space, you evolve into common language, and then you actually start creating really powerful opportunities. And by the end of that project, the highest level scientists working in molecular biology came in and started examining the world space, like the VR environment, and came away thinking, we have never seen this relationship between the core elements of what we're working with. And there is a real possibility that we can make advances in science just by understanding a sort of space-time relationship between the pieces. So a long-winded answer to say that I think that it's the shift that we need to make from the idea of what we think of storytelling as the linear into this environmental, deeply immersive, highly collaborative, and evolutionary, fluid, chaotic, holistic, all of those kind of words, where the world is actually never static, and every new piece of information becomes a dynamic force within that world, within the way the stories evolve. And the stories move all of the time, but you capture them in different media. Also, we're completely media agnostic, so whatever medium is the correct medium, a poster is just as valid, or a comic book, or a mixed reality outcome, depending on what story you're telling. But we work our way towards outcomes, and I think that we have a very real opportunity to do things that we've never had before, because one of the things we can do as storytellers is we can engage non-storytellers in the experience of the story because of the tools we have. They can dive inside these narratives, and just like that kind of VR experience, as low resolution as it is, you engage in a completely different relationship to the story because of those tools. And that goes back to the idea of us extending our capability, I would say.
And also, this is essential part of the process, because we always work with people from very different disciplines, because that's the whole idea, that they challenge what we know, and that we all together bring those parameters and the frame in which we are thinking and we are playing. And actually, when we create from the constraints, from the frame in which we are thinking. Because when we are creating, what we are doing is actually problem solving. So when we are creating this structure that is very well defined so that people can understand the world they are living in from any point of view, either from a macro point of view or from a micro point of view, then everyone starts talking the same language. So the people that are informing the process in a particular way leave us to a point that we can imagine how to extrapolate. But then what we are doing actually with the corner is knowing how we could go in a certain direction that often is kind of dystopic, but then how can we hack that process at some point? How can we extrapolate things that are unavoidable, but then at some point we can hack them into a different, what we call story vector, something that actually diverges from there. What do we need to do that? So we need to see into the future, but then we can also see an alternative, and this is how we do it, by understanding all the connectivity of the different elements that are part of that world. That goes for any kind of story, but in that particular case, when you bring people that actually are experts that usually don't meet, that's the way to do it, to understand what are the rules that are connecting into that story, into that world in particular, and then how they evolve in time. And then this is the common language in which the fiction allows the participation in a horizontal plane of every one of the participants into one of those processes. There was another question over there.
just have a bit of a question, I guess, in general, because I feel like this discussion is very interesting, but at the same time, you call, for example, for challenging everything, right, and questioning everything. Especially the questioning part is important, and I wonder how much there has been also a questioning of this focus on technology, which I'm not saying that technology is not interesting and important to look at, but I think there is a very strong focus on it here, which surprises me and which I think is a bit sad. And then the other thing is also the way in which the individual is put at the center. I think here it says human, which is another thing, but in your story you were talking about individuals. I'm not sure that that is necessary. I think that can also be questioned, especially in a street corner. And I think in that and in challenging a lot more than what has been presented here, for example, you know, when you look into the future and you think about automated vehicles, is that really what we have to look at, a vehicle, car that does something more sophisticated but still is a car? Or do we actually maybe want to invest that energy and time into developing something entirely different, which I think would be a lot more interesting. And, you know, also perhaps challenging the economic ideas that we have been working with for a while. So all of these things, I think that would be an interesting direction to go in with world building, because I think stories can be incredibly powerful in actually doing that. And I think it's a bit of a shame that there's this strong focus on those topics that, yes, are being developed, and there is really interesting stuff going on, but is that really enough? And I don't think it is. So maybe some reactions on that.
Thank you very much for that. I can't say I agree or disagree with you, because there's a huge debate within the research community now on the role of technology. I'll give a very simple example. Part of the discussion around how to solve the climate change problem includes massive technologies that suck out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And most of the modeling that are used by the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, this is the body that is supposed to be rallying governments to work together in finding solutions. Most of the models actually include that technological aspect. And most of you know that if you include the technology aspect, we have quite a few years, or give or take, within which, if we deploy those technologies, we can still stay within 2 degrees. But I promise I'm not going to bore you with these numbers. The point here being, our calculation is that technology is going to evolve at a certain pace, and with such impact that it would rescue us from quite many of the problems that we have out there. There is another view that part of this has to do with the way we're living, that we're living in a world of excesses, that we just want to be creature comforts without reining in our appetites. And there are all these narratives that are going on. But the point remains that historically we've seen the evolution of technology at paces that we could never predict. It also remains that, while you can say that, we also know that there are so many instances where the implications of technology on humans and lifestyles has led to less happiness, or in some cases, longer lives without necessarily being happier lives. There are all these caricatures around all of this, but the point here being we need a healthier debate around the implications of this. But I'm going to try to shift a bit from this towards what I think a creative community, where it really comes into play, and how it can help in elevating the discussion beyond caricatures here and there. Part of the struggle now in terms of discussions of translating science into policy is that most of what our governments have used, most of the parameters we've used in developing society have been geared towards growing the economy, measured by what you call the gross domestic product. This is how big or active an economy is. One perverse way of thinking of it is that if more people get sick and get to the hospital, and the hospital generates more income out of that, the economy grows bigger. You can imagine this is a very twisted, of course, the GDP is not all about this, but you can also, another way of it is if we cut down more trees and we do more things to replace those trees and the economy gets more active, then our economy is growing. It's a slightly unhealthy, slightly is a very small word here. It's a rather unhealthy way of measuring our development as human beings. Recently, there's a discussion around centering development around our well-being rather than around how economies are growing. Shifting our taxes away from taxing people's incomes to begin to tax how much resource you're taking out of the ground. Beginning to shift how we evaluate people's well-being based less on how much they can gather as materials, but more on how they're experiencing life and how they're sharing life. A part of this, I use well-being deliberately because there are some friends of mine that use happiness. It's the same community, but because happiness is a slightly more fluid word than well-being. Very cautious, scientifically minded communities tend to use the word well-being, but replace one with the other and you have the same thing they're talking about, potato, patata. So the point here becomes, if you're shifting from an economic-centered society to a well-being-centered society, there are a few things that we've discovered that it's not conclusive, but that are central to what we are as humans, and that make us well-being, happiness, that make us happy. This includes a sense of belonging, being a part of a community. It could be defined as virtual community in these days. It doesn't really matter. Meaningful engagement in society. Another way of thinking of it is having a job or doing something which you think actually contributes to society as against draining society. Another one is building trust in society and having a life of dignity. Having basic security and subsistence. We can all imagine these are the things that ground us as humans. A larger question becomes, to me, to connect it to the technology aspect, is what is the role of technology in all of this? How do you see technology addressing some of the constraints we face from a resource perspective and so on, without necessarily putting the negative aspects on well-being? And when you combine the aspirations of a society that is so addicted to its stuff and the constraints that we face, what narratives can you develop? What scenarios can you develop? What future orientation can we collaboratively develop that helps us see other pathways than those primarily only driven by technologies or only primarily driven by economic indicators? These are things where science comes up against the limits of what a creative society could help in doing. And I dare say a group like this could do a lot more in that respect to enhance the primary messages that are coming out of the sciences.
I think that's a fluid space, because what Louis is talking about precisely in the conversation between technology and what we are doing right now. And this is why I was saying at the beginning, also preemptively, because at some point when we have these discussions, the idea of technology gets very present. And this is what I was saying, that actually this way of approaching, that's the technology we are relying on, which is trying to transform the way we approach. The rest are tools in which we can either pre-visualize new outcomes, or we can try to understand by world building what are the ideals that have constructed our present. Because this is the point. Those ideals and those aspirations constructed the present we live in. Therefore, the ideals that we are growing for our generation and the generations that come afterwards are going to build the future. So at the end, I think it's just a fluid space in which that discussion has to happen at the same time. What are the aspirations that we are building for ourselves and our society, and how technology makes it a part of that? Because we cannot go to one side or to the other without ignoring the combination and that discussion.
But how much of that has to be technology-based? I mean, I think that world building as a technology is a whole other thing, but when it comes to us thinking about, okay, in the world building exercise, what are we considering as a possible future? Why does that have to have so much to do with technology? I think what you were saying as an answer, I think it's really interesting story, but actually I'm not sure that answers the question of whether or not we should be focusing in world building on doing, on developing technology solutions, because maybe we can actually come up with a solution to those problems that doesn't have to be technology.
Sorry, just to give some feedback, I was here with them, I attended my first workshop with them, and I think one of our tasks as like filmmakers or people who are involved in in arts is hacking the system. So that car is gonna happen. We know that automated car is gonna happen. And whether I want it or not, it's kind of gonna happen. And it's happening right now. So what we can do, like some values that we can protect, like local businesses, I'm very concerned about that. I'm so scared that technology is gonna harm, it's gonna increase the gap between social classes even more. And so the idea is that the technology, there will be people who will be helpful in shaping the technology, but when we are thinking about the environment, we are also thinking about recreational stuff that should survive, in that surrounding. And we can, of course, have an impact on technology, but that's not the only thing we are doing.
It's also about solutions that we come up with that have nothing to do with technology, whether it's going to appear or not. Yes, maybe the automated vehicle is going to be there, but how much of it are we going to allow to dominate our lives? And I don't think that's a given. It's an interesting thing to see where it's going to go, and I think there's interesting stuff going on. I'm not saying I'm entirely against it, but I don't think this discussion needs to focus so much on that. That's my point.
Alex asked me to be contrarian earlier, so I will continue to be contrarian. So first of all, I don't think any of us are saying that the world building process philosophy is centered on technology at all. It's just, these are the examples, that a lot of it comes from science fiction, but that just is happenstance. It's not core to the methodology at all. Having done it, this is my opinion. First. Secondly, I'm curious about your general perspective. Technology is just our tools, right? So stone hand axe 3.5 million years ago, that was our first tool. That was technology, and it radically changed our species, right? We could suddenly eat a lot more meat, we get more protein, our brains get bigger, then we tame fire, we can cook the meat, eat more of it, digest it more quickly, brains get bigger, and so forth. So this sort of thing about technology being inherently bad, it's just tools. But I think my main point is world building is not necessarily technologically focused. It's just a tool about how to build systems in which narratives take place. And for us, so we are not in the business of creating narrative, but we use narrative in order to explore the things that we could create as projects, products, businesses, whatever. And it's super powerful. So to us, it's kind of this black box that's a prototyping machine. First, you have to build the world. Once you have it, then you like drop things into it. We're like, oh, what if we had autonomous cars? Well, what would be an alternative to these big heavy vehicles that were like mini houses driving people around? Couldn't you do it much more efficiently? And you drop that into the world, and the world spits out a result. So I don't know, I'm wandering, I'm just trying to be contrarian.
No, here, yeah.
But thank you for that question, because I think it is, it's an important question to keep asking. I will just quickly say that I think that one of the reasons that, like, I did a focus on new tools is because an industry that has embraced the idea of tools since the first camera as being, scientific leaders in that space are ignoring things that are much more like an extension of our intuition. I'm not even going to call it technology or tools, but that we're getting back closer to the idea of what a pencil is as a perfect tool, something that's a direct extension of our intuition to outcome. And we will stop talking about these tools as technology because they'll become just intuitive, and I think that's what I'm looking forward to, is getting past that. As an example of world building that's not particularly focused on any of this question, where I go next is to Alaska to engage with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council, who are representing 11 Alaskan Native tribes, who are looking at how they should extend their mythologies and their stories into the future, and they're looking at it in response to things like climate change and the things that we are doing to screw up our world, to the extent that their mythologies no longer are keeping up with the pace of change that's going on around them because of the damage we've caused. But the first thing they'll say is, don't treat us as noble savage. We are early adopters of technology. They invented sunglasses 100 years before sunglasses existed, et cetera, exactly to Maurice's point. They need tools from morning to night, you know, and they know exactly what they want. And if they find something new to come along, they're using rapid fabrication in the most advanced possible way in Anchorage in Alaska in the native community, because those tools were much more appropriate for them than, you know, a knife. So,
I want to connect the first. Sorry.
Another
oh,
question.
okay.
Go. Hello. It's just something that I just want to throw out there, like a cherry bomb. And I really liked your question statement. Back to what Lewis said way in the beginning about the issue of, in our stories, in narrative, we have characters. And, I'm very confused, but I'm not confused. I just saw Black Panther and loved it. But as a communist, I also was terrified because it's projecting hero worship, which is what all of these comic book characters are, heroes, which is a very right-wing way of thinking about the future. And so how can we sort of grab onto that hero worship, but transfer it into a more progressive people worship? People, all of us, because we're the ones who are going to change the world and lead artificial intelligence to save the world. So I feel like that's the missing thing, is the humans and what are we doing? And also in terms of, as a writer, I'm really excited about what Megan was talking about in terms of writing for gaming, but again, gaming is also a place where there's been so much right-wing storytelling with, you know, shoot 'em up, kill 'em up, eat 'em up. So anyway, I'm not really making sense, but it's just some ideas that have been bubbling up in me that I hope can help your world building.
I actually wanted to connect, thank you for your question. The first challenge on what's to be a narrator, because at the end it's an expanded version of that. And then on the other side is this idea that what we are doing here can tackle communities at the same time that can actually connect to this community. I was working with dancers in a city in Colombia that is called Buenaventura. They have no particular access to any advanced technology beyond little MP3s and so on. And then we started studying them for a project that we were doing. And what we discovered was the structure of a warrior and a hero, but it was specific. There was no combat beyond their dance. So what we started doing is world build around them, the mythology of someone that is as a hero, but with different set of values. So we created the code of the warrior, but it was a different code that was specific. It was the rules of combat, and the stories that emerged from that had nothing to do with developing something in VR. It was more these kind of dynamics that were between them already, and what we embedded on that by understanding what they already had there and create a myth from that. From that same project, the community in the Pacific of Colombia started understanding that this projection could help. So the government of the Pacific, that it's a big organization that is trying to develop the coast, approached us and told us, how can we see the future of this region through that process? So obviously we will use tools if we, at some point we engage with that project, but it's more about the people than about anything else that could connect to a particular technology. Maybe technology will allow that development, but it's about understanding what is the ground of those people and what's the life that inhabits these people, and then how that is going to transform or what. And going back to the aspirations are going to drive that future. And that is what connects to our practice of understanding the connectivity, and we call it an ecology, is because everything moves, it's in flow in the different elements and areas of knowledge that we are trying to understand. Anyone wants to? I think at some point we want to, if there's any questions, let's make one last question, and then we are going to close. Here.
So I love the fact that when you were trying to imagine the future of the new world, you looked at the future of advertising. And in films and in advertising, they usually adopt new technology a lot faster than filmmakers do, simply because of the extreme, short form of content and higher budgets. For example, VR and AR was used there on a massive scale rather than in films. And the technology that we're working in advertising right now is DCO, which is dynamic creative optimization, where the ad or the landing page that you see is actually optimized based on the data we have about you in terms of your age, your preferences, what you watched. So it becomes that the message is more user-centric than the narrative-centric. So do you think this is the direction where films are going to go in terms of being interactive, but instead of giving you a choice, the choices are already pre-made by the technology in terms of making the narrative and the film that you see based on the information we have about you?
No. I mean, I guess my response to that is I think that the biggest market I can see ahead of us is paying for not having that level of interference with, excluding our data from the space entirely. There are some really interesting things going on, I think, in the game space, moving towards narratives that are actually kind of not interactive for the audience, but are highly interactive for the maker. And I guess my encapsulation of your question to answer is that I think that the really interesting space is how we change our relationship as creators to the development of the medium and the media. Ultimately, I don't think people want to have any kind of space that they don't have active choice in making those interactions with. And I think that advertising is going to learn that relatively quickly, because people are going to find every possible way of blocking that form of kind of user-controlled, user-directed. It's not really storytelling, but the sort of specificity. But as I say, going back to the previous point, I'm really interested and engaged in the idea of our intuitive relationship to the creative processes and how you can sort of push and pull the narrative as a community, how all of that can be embodied. In fact, I think in a very analog way, the street corner world building is exactly that. Like, of the 40 people that we have in the room, everyone is having this sort of ability to sculpt the way in which those narratives develop. And there will be a direct relationship between the outcome of that and the engagement of the creators as a group and as a community. And I think that there's a lot to learn from that in the way that data starts to behave and respond.
Okay, I think we're going to conclude for now. So first of all, I'm going to thank you all for being here and being part of this discussion and so active in allowing us to think further. And especially I want to thank all of our special guests and our mentors for being here, and obviously the talents for hosting us 1 year more to have this powerful discussion that's bringing people together into thinking what is to be human actually as a storyteller. Thank you very much. Thank you.